Part 2 of Culture and Team, and we have Ben Silverman, the founder of Pinterest, and John and Patrick Collison, the founders of Stripe. Founders that have obviously sort of some of the best in the world at thinking about culture and how they build teams. So there's 3 areas that we're going to cover today. One will just be sort of general thoughts on culture as a follow-up to the last lecture, and then we're really going to dig into what happens at the founding of these companies and building out the early team, and then how that changes and evolves as these guys have scaled their companies up to 100 plus. I don't even know how many people you have now, but quite a lot. These very large organizations, and how you adapt these principles of culture. But to start off, I just want to ask a very open-ended question, which is, what are the core pieces of culture that you found to be most important in building out your companies?
I'll start with that. Sure. What are the most important parts?
Yeah, it's on.
Oh, it's on. Yeah, I mean, I think for us, like, we think about it on a few dimensions. Like, one is, like, who do we hire and what do those people value? 2 is, what do we do every day? Like, why do we do it? 3 is, what do we choose to communicate? And then I think the 4th is what we choose to celebrate. And I guess the converse of that is, like, what you choose to punish. But in general, I think running a company based on what you celebrate is more exciting than what you punish. But I think those 4 things kind of make up the bulk of it for us.
That we've placed a large emphasis on as Stripe has grown, and probably more than other companies, is transparency internally. And I think it's something that's been really valuable for Stripe, and also a little bit misunderstood. All the things people talk about, like, hiring really great people or giving them a huge amount of leverage, transparency for us plays into that. We think that, if you are aligned at a high level about what Stripe is doing, if everyone really believes in the mission, and then if everyone has really good access to information and kind of has a good picture of the current state of Stripe, then that gets you a huge amount of the way there in terms of working productively together, and it kind of forgives a lot of the other things that tend to break as you grow a startup. And so as we've grown, we started off 2 people. We're now over 170 people. We've put a lot of thought into the tooling that goes around transparency, because, at 170 people, there is so much information being produced that you can't just consume it all as a fire hose. And so how we, use Slack, how we use email, things like that. We can go into it more later. But I think that's one of the core things that's helped us work well.
I think culture, to some degree, is basically kind of the resolution to a bandwidth problem, in the sense that maybe when you start out working on something, you're sort of coding all the time, but you can't code all of the things that you think the product might need or the company might need or whatever, and so you decide to work with more coders, right? And so, the organization gets larger, and maybe in some idealized world, I don't think this is actually true, but kind of ideally, you could be involved in every single decision, in every single sort of moment of the company, and everything that happens, but obviously you can't, or maybe you can at 2 people, but you certainly can't at even like 5 or 10, kind of that point comes very quickly. Then by the time you're 50, it's completely hopeless. And so culture is kind of how you, kind of what the strands are that you sort of want to have, the invariants that you want to kind of maintain as you can get specifically involved in sort of fewer and fewer decisions over time. And I think when you think about it that way, maybe its kind of importance becomes sort of self-evident, right? Because again, like, the fraction of things you can be involved in directly is like diminishing, almost exponentially, sort of assuming your headcount growth is sort of on a curve that looks like, one of the great companies. That's super important, and kind of it manifests itself in a bunch of different ways. Like, for example, in hiring, I think a large part of the reason why maybe the first 10 people you hire, what kind of those decisions are so important, is because you're not just hiring those first 10 people, you're actually kind of hiring 100 people, because you should think of kind of each one of those people as bringing along sort of another 10 people with them, and sort of figuring out exactly what 90 people you would like those first 10 people to bring along is obviously it's going to be quite consequential for your company. But really briefly, I think it's largely about sort of abstraction.
So one thing that a lot of speakers in this class have touched on is how hiring those first 10 employees, if you don't get that right, the company basically will never recover. But no one's talked about how to do that. So what have the three of you looked for when you've hired these initial employees to get the culture of the company right? How have you found them, and what have you looked for?
Sure. So I guess this answer is different for every company, and I'll say for us it was very inductive. So I literally looked for people that I wanted to work with and that I thought were talented. I think I've read all these books about culture because when I don't know how to do something, I first go read things, and everyone has all these frameworks. And I think one big misconception that someone said once is that people think culture is like architecture when it's a lot more like gardening. You plant some seeds and then you pull out weeds that aren't working, and they sort of expand. So when we first hired people, we hired people that were like ourselves. And I often looked at like 3 or 4 different things that I really valued in people. I looked for people that worked hard and seemed high integrity and low ego. I looked for people that were creative, and that usually meant they were really curious and they had all these different interests. Some of our first employees are probably some of the quirkiest people I've ever met. They were engineers, but they also had all these crazy hobbies. Like one guy had made his own board game with his elaborate set of rules. Another guy was really into magic tricks, and he had coded not only like this magic trick on the iPhone, but he had shot the production video in the preview. And I think that quirkiness has actually been a little bit of a calling card, and we find that really creative, quirky people that are excited about many disciplines and are extraordinary at one tend to build really great products, and they tend to be great at collaborating. And the last thing is, we really look for people that they just wanted to build something great, and they weren't arrogant about it, but they just felt like it'd be really cool to take a risk and build something bigger than themselves. And that at the beginning is very, very easy to select for. If you were in our situation, we had this horrible office, like nobody got paid, and so there was no external reason other than being excited about building something to join. In fact, there was every reason not to. And that's something, looking back, I really, really value, because we always knew people were joining for the purest reasons, and in fact, we're willing to forgo other great job opportunities, market salary, a clean office, good equipment, just for the chance to work. And so to this day, I think a lot of those traits have been seeded and are embedded in the folks that we look at now.
The first 10 hires are really hard because you're making these first 10 hires at a point where no one's heard of this company, no one really wants to work for it. You're just these like 2 weird people working on this weird idea.
Like their friends are telling them not to join. For our second employee, he was like, I think maybe he'd accepted the offer, or he was just about to, and his best friends took him out the night before. It was like a full-on assault for why you should not join this company, why this is like ruining your life, basically. And so anyway, the guy subsequently continued to join, and actually one of those friends also now works at Stripe. But this is what you're up against.
Yeah. And I mean, it's also hard because no batch of 10 people will have as great an influence on the company as those first 10 people. And I think everyone's impression of recruiting is, you open LinkedIn, it's sort of like ordering off the dollar menu. You just I want that one and that one and that one, and now you have some hires. Whereas, at least for us, it was very much over a very long time period, talking people we knew or friends of friends into joining. We didn't have huge networks. Patrick and I were both in college at the time, so there were no people that we'd really worked with to draw on. And so a lot of those early Stripes were people we had heard of, friends of friends. And the other interesting thing they all had in common is that they were all sort of early in their career or undervalued in some way. Because when you think about it, if someone is a known spectacular quantity, then they're probably working in a job and very happy with that. And so we had to try and find people who were, in the case of our designer that we hired, he was 18 and in high school and in Sweden at the time. In the case of our CTO, he was in college at the time. A lot of these people, they were early on in their careers, and the only way we could, you can relax one constraint. You can, relax the fact that they're talented, or relax, that it's apparent that they're talented. And we not consciously, but we relax the latter.
Yeah, I think sort of finding kind of the people who are kind of, I guess you have to kind of think like a value investor, right? You're looking for the human capital that's significantly undervalued by the market. You probably shouldn't look to hire your brilliant friends at Facebook and Google or whatever, because they're already discovered. If they're willing to join, that's great, but they're probably harder to convince. John and I spent a while yesterday afternoon sort of trying to figure out in retrospect what kind of traits our first 10 or so people had in common that we thought were significant. In general, sort of in speaking about culture, I sort of want to caveat everything we say with, Paul Buchheit, I think, said that sort of advice is, very limited experience, wildly over-extrapolated. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. But for our particular first 10 people, the things we sort of figured out that seemed to be important were they're all sort of very genuine and straight. I think that actually matters quite a lot, in that sort of they're people that others want to work with, that they're people that others trust. They sort of have an intellectual honesty in how they approach problems and so forth. They were people who really liked getting things finished. There's a lot of people who are really excited about tons of things. Only a subset of those are actually excited about completing things. There's a lot of talk about, for example, hiring people off their GitHub resumes or whatever. I actually think that doesn't quite ring kind of correct to me, in the sense that places a large premium on sort of lots of different things. I think it's actually a priori sort of much more interesting to work with someone who has spent 2 years sort of really investing in going deep in a particular area. And then the third trait that they all seem to have in common is they just sort of cared a great deal. Like, it was offensive to them when something was just a little bit off. And kind of, again, in hindsight, there are all these crazy things we used to do that do in fact seem crazy. Like, we probably shouldn't have done them, but everyone was always was borderline insane in sort of how much they cared about tiny details. Like, we used to every single API request that ever generated an error went to all of our inboxes and phoned all of us, because it seemed terrible to ever have an error that didn't go and sort of get a resolution from the user standpoint. Or we used to copy everyone else on every outgoing email, and we'd point out slight grammar or spelling mistakes to each other, because it'd be terrible to ever send an email with a spelling mistake. Anyway, those were the three traits we came up with. Anyway, genuine, caring a great deal, and sorry, what was my second one?
The other one.
Yes. Sorry. Yes. Completing things, like list of 3 items.
Yeah, the only thing to say, I just don't think there's any wrong place to find people. So when I look back at our first few folks that we hired, they came from all over the place. I put up ads on Craigslist. I went to random tech talks. We met people at we used to throw weekly barbecues at the office. It was bring your own food and drinks, and then we would just talk to folks. I think every time I ever went and got coffee in Palo Alto, one of you guys was recruiting at Coupa, because their office was strategically situated next to the best coffee shop. But I think that the really good people generally, they're generally doing something else, and so you have to go seek them out rather than expecting that they're going to seek you out. Triple so when no one's ever heard of or is using the product that you're working on.
Yeah, and it's probably really important to have a great elevator pitch, not even for investors, but just because everyone you run into right now is, maybe 6 months, a year down the road, a potential recruit. And so the right time to have gotten them excited about your company, the right time for them to have started following it and, be thinking about it as they think about what they're going to do next, is, as soon as you can start. It's going to take a very long time to recruit people, so being able to consistently get people excited about what you're doing will pay back dividends later.
Maybe this is a little bit tangential, but John and I were also chatting about yesterday afternoon. Sort of a bunch of our friends have sort of started companies right out of school. We're sort of thinking about what seems to go wrong in those companies, and I think something that maybe the most common failure mode seems to be sort of doing something kind of overly niche or overly sort of specific and bounded. I think maybe it comes from sort of there's a major shift in time horizon as you go from classes to building a startup, right? A class kind of plays out on a quarter or a semester or whatever, whereas a startup is like a 5 or 10 year thing. And I think this is really problematic because it's actually quite hard to hire people for niche things in that if you tell somebody, look, we're going to build a rocket that goes to Mars, like, I mean, that sounds almost impossible, but also sounds fucking awesome, right? And so it's actually pretty easy to convince people to work on it. Whereas if it's, well, we're going to build this, I don't want to single out any particular idea because I sound like I'm picking some actual startup that's doing it, but if you pick something pretty narrow, something that maybe kind of inductively comes out of the kinds of problems you solve as part of a class project, that's actually much harder to hire for.
One specific question that has come up a lot is how, as a relatively inexperienced founder, do you identify who the really great people are? So, you meet people at these barbecues or for your friends or whatever, and maybe you've worked with them a little bit, but what specifically did you guys do in your processes to identify, like, what, this person's going to be really great? Or when did you really get it wrong? But what have you learned about how to identify raw talent if you can't just say, well, they work at Google or Facebook, they must be good?
Well, I mean, you'll never 100% know, obviously, until you work with folks, which is why the flip side of it is, if someone you hire just wasn't a good fit, you owe it to the company and to them to tell them how they can improve, and if they're not working out, to fire them. But I think that generally that question of talent falls into two big buckets. One is you have some sense of what makes them good at their job, and there are some areas where you have taste in that area, and there's some where you don't. And the ones where you don't are actually much more difficult. So what we would do is we would do a few things. First, before talking to anyone, we try to get a sense for what is really world class in that discipline mean. And this becomes very, very important later when you're hiring things like head of finance, and you don't know anything about finance except what was contained in a library book you got about an introduction to finance, or head of marketing. I always made it a habit of talking to people that I knew de facto were world class, and then asking them specifically, what are the key traits or characteristics that you look for? What are the questions that you ask? And how do you find them? And if you're looking for the next person that's as good as you, where is that person working right now? And what's her phone number? I think that learning what good and bad is during the interview process is extremely expensive. It's an expensive use of your time, and it's an expensive use of everyone else's time. So pre-calibration of that really matters. And then once you have someone in sort of the interview process, you'll build the process over time to both screen quality. And so at Pinterest, we have an evolving set of standard questions that we're always rotating through, and we're always measuring, are these good indicators or bad indicators of quality? But the other thing that the questions are meant to do is they're supposed to give a sense for, is this the right place for that person to come and work? And this is to the point you guys made about being very transparent about what's going to be easy or hard. Really great people want to do things that are hard. They want to solve tough problems. And so there was a certain brilliance in Google setting out these interview questions that were thought to be really difficult, because then people who like solving really difficult problems, they come out and seek those. I think it's really important, even as companies get bigger, that you don't whitewash the risks. I heard that PayPal, you would go in, and after interviewing with Peter Thiel and Max Levchin, then they would say, and by the way, Visa and MasterCard want to kill us, and we might be doing something that's illegal, but if you succeed, you'll redefine payments. Or when they were recruiting for the iPhone, they didn't even tell people what they were doing. They're you won't see your families for 3 years, but when you're done, your kids will remember what you built. And I think that's a really good thing in recruiting as well, that you're very, very transparent about why you think it's an amazing opportunity, but you lay out in gory detail why it's going to be hard, and then the right people select in, or they select out of that opportunity.
Evidence suggests it's worth allowing people to see their kids, though.
I feel like one thing you have to do as you try to identify talent is have the confidence to interview for it in a way that works for you. I think if you're say you're not the world's best engineer, and you're trying to interview engineering candidates, I think it's tempting to try to cargo cult to what everyone else does, and get them to code on a whiteboard and do other engineering interviewee things. In the case of Stripe, hiring our first engineer, we flew the guy out and we spent a weekend coding with him, and looked over his shoulder, and kind of it was the only way we could really tell and get ourselves confident that person was good. And I think you can actually extend that to other roles where, again, you're not an expert, and that I'm no business development guru, but when we interview people for business development roles, we'll ask them to do a project, where they talk about how they would improve an existing partnership that Stripe has, or which new partnerships they would go out and do. And again, even though it's not my domain area, I am actually confident enough that I can judge those pretty well. And I think people often have this imposter syndrome when it comes to interviewing for roles.
Yeah, I think a pretty specific kind of just tactical thing to do for, again, the first 10 people is to work with them as much as you can before committing to hiring them. I mean, once you reach a certain scale, it's kind of impractical because it's a huge time commitment on their side, and also, it just would be unscalably expensive from your side. But it's really worth it to get the first 10 people right. And so for a majority, maybe even all of the first 10 people, we worked with them in some capacity, usually for a week in advance. And it's pretty hard to fake it for a week. People, it tended to be pretty clear quite quickly. Another thing I thought of, to the question of sort of how do you know who's great or who's good enough or whatever, and people always talk about sort of this notion of the 10x person at sort of whatever the skill set is. I don't really know what 10x means. I think maybe the slightly more kind of helpful or intuitive version of that is this person probably the best out of all of their friends at what they do? And so it's a little bit sensitive to how well they choose friends and how many they have, but for me at least, I find that kind of a more helpful way to think about it. Is this the best engineer this engineer knows? And the other thing I think that's actually probably just worth mentioning in all this kind of first 10 people, or even more generally on the culture and hiring topic, I think everyone sort of doesn't realize until they go through it themselves how important it is, in large part because in life and the media and everything, people focus way too much on founders, and that here we are, and so kind of we're reinforcing the sort of structural narrative that Stripe is about John and Patrick and Pinterest is about Ben and so forth. Whereas, obviously sort of the vast majority of what our companies do, 99.9%, is being done by people who are not us, right? And I think, obviously that's kind of it's obvious when you say it, but it's sort of very much not just the macro narrative, and companies are abstract, so you kind of need to associate them with specific people. But I think it's worth bearing in mind that for Apple, everything was Steve Jobs was a tiny detail at the end, right? Or Google with Larry and so forth.
So don't screw it up, is what you're saying?
Something like that.
I think the only other thing I'll mention is that I think referencing people is really important, and referencing people is just what it sounds like. You're basically asking people who have real material working experience for their honest opinion. And we do that really aggressively. And what we're trying to figure out is, what's this person like to work with? We're not trying to validate whether they told the truth on their resume, because we assume that they're telling the truth. So very standard questions that I'll ask somebody is, in an interview, I might say, hey, we both know Jonathan in common. I'm going to talk to him, in a couple weeks because we're both social friends. If I asked him what you're the best at, or what you would be most proud of, or what you were kind of working to improve, what would he or she say? Because it sort of tests the level of self-awareness and creates a bit of social accountability. And then I'll try to ask something that makes the question, which is typically very soft, feel a little bit more quantitative, and then calibrate that over time. So, in evaluating this person on this dimension, do you think this is the top 1% of people you've ever worked with, the top 5%, and the top 10%? And it forces a scarcity that gives a materially different reference than if you just say, hey, what's the best thing about John? He told me, he's good at these things. Can you validate it? And you're yeah, sure, because they don't get anything. So I think that's just a tool that people should take seriously.
Yeah. Yeah, and referencing isn't obviously easy to begin with, but it does actually prove really useful over time. And you just have to, people, I think, especially for named references, people really want to be nice, so you have to do things like create an artificial scarcity by saying, where would you rank this person amongst the people you've worked with in this role? Or, there's lists out on the internet of how to reference, but you should aim to spend, 15 minutes on the phone with that person, not just let them say, yeah, this person is awesome, and then hang up.
But also a tremendous source of new recruits.
Yeah.
References are also a tremendous source of new recruits. What have each of you learned about once you hire these first people and they join? What have you done to make them effective quickly, to get them sort of to the right cultural place? Because sort of hiring is usually very difficult, but then not as difficult as making them happy and effective. So what do you do with these early employees to accomplish that?
Well, the answer that's changed when we've gone from really small to bigger. When we first started, we were generally hiring because we needed that person like a long time ago. And so their whole onboarding was like, here's your computer, we already set up your environment, don't worry about it, this is the problem that we have to solve together. And then because of the nature of the startup, so we were all in this like tiny 2-bedroom apartment, all of the other things like building personal relationships, spending time together, getting to know, it just all happened kind of automatically. Like you didn't have to do anything. The one thing that I would add to that is, though, we would always try to remind people of like where we wanted to go someday, because it's really easy when you first join to drop someone into a problem, and then they think the whole world is like this little problem in front of them. We'd always say, hey, someday we want to do for discovery what Google did for search, and this is our plan for trying to get that done. Now, as the company grows, I think that that process has to get a little bit more formalized, and so we spend a lot of time thinking and honestly trying to constantly refine what does that person's experience look like from the day they came in to their very first interview through 30 days after they join. Like, do they have somebody whose name they know? Do they know who their manager is? Have they sat down with people on their team? Do they know what the general architecture of the company is and what the top priorities are? And we have a program, and it's a week long, and then there are sort of function-specific programs that go in deeper. And that's something that's always been refined. And the output metrics that we look on that is, one, we ask people, like, what did you think afterwards, and then 30 days afterwards. And then we also ask their peers and their manager, like, hey, is this person kind of up to speed? Do you feel like we've done a good job making them productive? And if we haven't, that's a key, A, that team shouldn't be hiring any more people because they're not doing a good job bringing in new people. And B, that we need to retool that. And so I think those things are important. I just wouldn't discount just how important it is to get to know the person as a person. Like, what are their aspirations? What's their working style? How do they like to be recognized? Do they really prefer being in total silence? Are they a morning person or a night person? Like, knowing those things, I think it just demonstrates that you care about them individually as well as collectively, like what your goals are.
I think there's two things that are important at any stage, though the implementation will change. The first is to get them up and running, doing real work quickly, because that's only when you can find the problems. That's the only way that's how progress is measured, is how much real work they're doing. And so, when we have engineers start, we'll try to get them committing on the first day. When we have, people in business roles start, we will have them in real meetings on the first day on what they're meant to be working on. But I think sometimes there's a tendency to be tentative and help ease people in. We're much more of the push people off the cliff school. And then I think the second is to try and start quickly giving people feedback, and especially feedback on how to adapt to the culture. Because when you think about it, like, if you have built a strong culture, as all the companies up here, are trying to, then it's going to take some adapting for the person, and it's not going to be necessarily easy. One thing we had at Stripe was just the culture was a lot more written, and so you would have people who are right next to each other, each with headphones on, and just like IMing away to each other. And for a lot of people coming in who hadn't worked in an environment like that, it's sort of
in
hard.
Normal places.
Exactly, yeah. And so everything from kind of high level how you're doing at your job to kind of minor cultural pointers, the more feedback you can give them, the better they'll do. And it's unnatural, right? Because it's unnatural to be constantly telling people that they're doing a good or bad job. You don't do that. Hopefully in your normal life you're more restrained. But when you have employees, that's kind of what you owe them for them to do well.
So I think this is sort of a good transition to, as your companies have scaled, what are the biggest changes you've had to make to your hiring processes, and also how you sort of manage and run the teams as you've gone from 2 to 10 to 100 to 1,000 employees?
There are a lot of changes. I think one thing that we try to do on the team side is the goal is to make the teams feel as autonomous and nimble as possible within the constraints of having a large organization. And that means over time that we're always trying to make it feel like a startup of mini startups rather than this monolithic organization with a set of foreign processes that cut horizontally through it. And that's easier said than done. And I think that we're not all the way there, but one of our goals is that each team they control the resources that they need to get things done. They know what the most important thing is and how it's measured. In that way, then the management problem becomes somewhat tractable. Otherwise, it feels completely impossible. If you can't decompose it into autonomous units, you just look at it and you're like, oh my gosh, communication complexity is increasing geometrically, management complexity, it's never going to work. And so you have to sort of create these abstracted units, or that's at least what we're going to try to do. And at Pinterest in particular, the real challenge of creating those abstracted units is we want to actually have units that encompass a super strong designer, a super strong leader in engineering, often a writer, often sometimes a community manager. We want them all to be self-contained. And so that makes the problem really hard, but that's kind of core to our philosophy of how we build products. We try to put people together that have all of these different disciplines. They're curious about lots of things, and then we anchor them on a single project, and then we try to remove barriers to let them go fast. When we find new barriers, we sit down and we think, how do we speed that up? I think hiring is a little bit different, and I think the biggest change and the biggest asset that you get as you get more people is referrals become more and more and more and more the lifeblood, depending on sort of the network of all the people that you bring in. So one of the really lucky and, in hindsight, great decisions that we made was our actual 14th or 15th person that we hired was a professional recruiter. And she'd worked at startups, she'd worked at big companies like Apple, but she sort of knew where that pipeline breaks down, kind of knew the early indicators, and taught everyone not just how to sort of screen for talent, but how scalably to identify the people that are going to be culturally really good for the company. And I think looking back on that, it's something that I personally really value.
There's just a huge amount of stuff here, right? In that sort of, I guess this is all under kind of the rubric of managing growth, and either your company sort of fails very quickly, or sort of all of your problems become in some way about managing growth. One thing that I think tends to take people by surprise, and certainly took me by surprise, is kind of how quickly just the time horizons change, in that sort of in your first month, you're largely thinking about things on maybe 1 month ahead, right? In that maybe that's kind of what your development roadmap is oriented around. Even in terms of who you're working with, maybe it's really informal relationships where they haven't sort of fully committed to remain full-time or whatever, right? And that kind of the more time goes by, I think that kind of has a reciprocal or corresponding increase in the time horizon. So after 1 year, you're kind of thinking 1 year ahead. After 4 years, you're thinking 4 years ahead. And kind of that increases very quickly, right? And so after, say after 1 month, it's again super short term, and then just 11 months later, you should now actually be thinking and planning, a year ahead, and thinking about kind of human structures on that time horizon, thinking about stuff Ben talked about, where you want to be going long term and things like that. I think that also plays into your hiring and the kinds of people you hire, right? In that, in the really early days, you kind of have to hire people who will be productive essentially immediately. You don't have the luxury of hiring people who are sort of really promising, but they're not quite going to be up to speed for another year or two. They have to be able to contribute immediately. But after 2 or 3 years, now it sort of starts to get much more reasonable to make those investments. And in fact, if you're not making those investments, you're probably being much too short term. And so I think that's really important. A lot of it also just comes from sort of all these problems in some sense are easy. How do you build kind of good social bonds between people? I mean, we all do it every day, right? It's kind of how do you kind of make it systematic and sort of effective at scale? And it's always kind of a very severely imperfect approximation of what you would ideally do if you were small, and just kind of what hacks can you pull to sort of make it work as well as you possibly can at a larger scale. Like a rapidly growing company, say growing headcount 2 or 3x a year, just it's a very unnatural thing, and so it's sort of what's the least bad way of sort of managing that period of growth? Human organizations aren't designed for it. And I think it's worth being sort of quite systematic about sort of thinking about ways to do that, but realizing that you probably can't do much better than than sort of adequate. And for Stripe, it's things like we have 3 meals every day at sort of long tables where kind of everyone can sit together, right? And if you think of sort of net, how much more total human interaction happens as a result of having these kind of randomly mixed meals, I mean, it's vast, right? And there's kind of a whole list of things like that. But I think that's kind of the general framework.
And one thing I'm really curious about, you guys value transparency. How have you scaled it over time? 'Cause I know we think about figuring that out all the time. I'm just curious.
Startups in some sense, I can't remember who it was, sort of defined it as like a startup is kind of an organization that's not yet stuck with all these kind of principal agent problems. That at most sort of large companies, what is locally optimal for you is very frequently not what is globally optimal for the company. There, as a consequence of that, probably a lot of ways in which a startup can work differently to a big company. At a big company, a lot of the things that are good for you, you couldn't do them in a completely transparent environment, right? Because people would think less of you, or you're doing things you're not supposed to. But because everyone is kind of sailing or rowing in the same direction at a startup, you can actually just make all the information transparent, yeah, I mean, from a very early, I guess I mentioned earlier, like Stripe used to BCC every other person at Stripe on basically every single outgoing email unless you opted out of it, because we thought that would be sort of much more efficient. You wouldn't need to have as many meetings if you could just kind of keep abreast of what's happening. And over time, we've sort of built an increasingly intricate sort of framework of mailing lists, and we now have like a program for generating Gmail filters, and for like a pretty rocky patch where we were 50 people or so, to Ben's point of like asking people sort of how they're getting on after the first couple of days, they all reported terribly because like they couldn't even find all the emails people were sending to them, and they were missing things and everything.
Gmail broke at one stage.
Oh, right. At one point, Gmail broke because you were just like sending too much email. I mean, it is hard to scale because you might sort of contact somebody outside of the company with like some great idea, and maybe like the person sitting across the way from you thinks that's like the stupidest idea they've ever heard, right? And you're kind of subject to the scrutiny of the entire organization to some degree with all of your communication. Like that's kind of the challenging side of it, and then the good side is people are much more informed about what's happening. I guess I don't feel that I can give a much stronger endorsement of it than it has worked so far.
Pretty good endorsement.
Yeah, I'm actually really curious how or whether it'll work when we're 5,000 people or something like that, if we're ever at that scale.
I think the two things that have helped us scale it are, one, changing the tools, and two, developing the culture around it. And so on the tools front, it used to be the case that, or kind of the infrastructure, it used to be the case that you could keep abreast of what's happening in the company by reading all the email. Now we have, weekly all hands, sometimes with a deck, and we actually have to go put all this work into developing a deck to communicate to people what's going on in the company, since there's so much more. And the second is on the cultural side, so much information being available internally, you have to develop cultural norms around how it's treated. Obvious things like the fact that a lot of it is confidential to Stripe, but even less obvious things like when emailing someone or talking in Slack or IRC, when that is viewed by now 170 people, it's actually it's pretty easy to get stage fright. And it's pretty easy for what you thought was a reasonable proposal. You get this drive-by criticism, and you're now less likely to share in future. And so we've had to create norms around when it's reasonable to jump into discussions and how that interaction works, because people are on stage so much more.
I'm pretty sure it's net good, but not to put her on the spot, but Emily interned at Stripe this summer. I'm curious, like as an intern, what you thought of it.
I think overall it's great. I think like my first week I spent most of the time just reading Hackpad and getting caught up on what the company was doing. It can often be quite distracting from your own work, as there are oftentimes other parts of the company you're really interested in.
Hackpad, by the way, is like Google Docs but with a newsfeed, and you can just like see all the documents.
Yeah, and you're encouraged to make everything public, everything you work on. But overall it gets you spun up really quickly, and we also have things called spin-ups where every single sort of leader of a team at the company, whether it's like SIS or its product, gives like a 30-minute talk on what their team is currently doing and sort of how you can contribute if you're interested.
Did you think email transparency was net good?
Yes, I remember having a hard time understanding what I should and should not subscribe to, and like the first week having like 2,000 emails in my inbox, and then by the end, there's like 3 or 4 teams you actually want that information coming in from.
All right, audience questions. Yes.
So this question is for Patrick and John. Is it your experience that your early hires are able to grow and evolve into leadership roles as the company scales? And a question for Ben. How is what Pinterest is today, how is it different in your initial vision of what the product and the audience would be?
All right, we'll go first on. Have the people, actually all 3 of you are welcome as this, have the people that you've hired early been able to grow into leadership roles?
In Stripe's case, yes, in that quite a number of the first 10 people are in leadership roles now. I think that's one thing that organizations, again, it's sort of an unnatural skill that they have to get good at, is realizing that people don't necessarily come out of the womb being good at managing or being good at leadership, and being able to develop that in people, and being able to help people progress as they spend a number of years at the company. It's a lot of work at a time when everyone is running around with their hair on fire, but it's also sort of damaging if the company can't develop that skill.
Yeah, I think for us the answer is some yes and some no. I don't know, I think one of the big benefits of working at a startup is that you can be handed a challenge that no one else would be crazy enough to give you the opportunity to take on. And that could be managing people, it could be taking on a project. But the implicit contract with that is that if you can ask someone to take a really big risk on that, it shouldn't be like one way through the door, and if you don't succeed, otherwise it creates fright to give it a shot. So, we have some folks that are managing large teams that started as kind of individual programmers where they were engineering, and they said, hey, I'd love to try leading a project and then leading a group and then taking responsibility for management and taking a group. And we have other folks that tried it and they were like, I'm really glad I tried it because I never want to do that again. And we try to make sure that for those people, like you can have just as much impact at a company through your individual contributions as an engineer or designer. You don't have to manage. But it's really hard to predict until you give people a shot. And so my strong preference is that you give as many people a shot as possible. And in the few areas where you really feel like there's too much kind of learning curve relative to the business objective you're trying to achieve, that's when you look for somebody who might be able to walk in and really execute well on that job.
And you want to answer the Pinterest question?
Oh, so the question was, how's the vision changed since we initially started?
Yes.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think on the vision, when we first started, I think we started it like hiring very inductively. We were like, oh, we're going to build this really cool tool. People are going to enjoy it. I love collecting things. Maybe other people like collecting things. And what we didn't expect that kind of revealed itself early on was that looking at other people's collections turns out to be this really amazing way to discover things that you didn't know you were looking for. And it becomes kind of a solution to a problem that a lot of other technologies don't have. And so over the last couple of years especially, we've poured enormous kind of technical and design resources into building out recommendations products, search products, feed products, leveraging kind of the unique data that we have, which are these pins that were all hand-picked by someone and hand-categorized. And then on the audience side, I mean, I think the first big surprise was, truthfully, like when we first started, we didn't really know if anyone would use it, and we were just happy that anybody that wasn't like related to us and obligated by like familial relationship would use it. And so one of the biggest surprises has been how many people and how diverse those groups of people have been. And so I think that's been one of the things that's really exciting. And the funny thing is that as often like the company goes farther along, your aspirations therefore like get bigger. So there's like this gap that always exists, I tell my team, between like where we are and where I think we should be. And even though objectively we're much farther along, I feel like the gap is widened even farther. But I think that's a really common trait amongst people who found companies.
Yes.
You said that while selling the vision of the company, you have to describe in gory detail that how hard it is going to be, and you won't see their families for 3 years, but then it will also be the thing that their grandchildren will be proud of. But how do you really know, both of you know that the second part is it's not guaranteed, but the first part, that they're not going to see their family for the next year, is going to be there for sure. So like, how can you be authentic, like selling that vision of the company, or is it like about like giving high returns for the high risk they're taking, giving them a lot of equity?
Great question.
What is that really
So the question is, most startups are not the iPhone. You can't guarantee that people's grandchildren are going to remember this because most startups fail. How do you convince people to sort of make the sacrifices to join a startup?
I think part of the way sort of in which it resonates with people is because it's not guaranteed, right? If it were guaranteed, then it'd be boring. And so it's the sort of, there is the prospect of sort of, affecting this outcome, but nothing more than that potential. To the sort of not seeing their families or kids or whatever. I mean, startups often do involve sort of longer hours in the beginning, but I think I think that particular story is probably somewhat overstated. I think Scott Forstall was trying to recruit these people, but I mean, even though startups, especially in the earlier days, tend to involve somewhat longer working hours, I think there's kind of this tendency to exaggerate it and sort of, I mean, it's like the startup version of fishing. Like every startup thinks they worked even more insane hours than the next one back in the early days. Like we literally never slept for 2 years. So I don't know. I think that realistically, for most people, it's not that big a sacrifice, right? You're maybe on average. Being really realistic about it, people work 2 hours more on average per day. It's certainly a sacrifice, but it is not foregoing all pleasure and enjoyment for the next half decade.
Yeah, I mean, I think even the iPhone wasn't the iPhone before it got done, right? So, I mean, no smart person you're hiring is under the illusion that you have a crystal ball into the future that only you have, and that joining is a guaranteed thing. And in fact, if you're telling them that and they select in, you probably shouldn't hire them because they didn't pass like a basic intelligence test about uncertainty in the future. But I think it's fair to say what's exciting and where you think it can go and where it's going to be hard, and chart your best plan, and then tell them why their role in it can be instrumental, because it is. I really liked what you said. If you tell people hey, we're going to go to Mars, it attracts the best people, and then you're incrementally closer to getting to Mars, and they know that going in. What I would discourage doing is just whitewashing all of that. And if people kind of are joining because they want I want all the certainty and guarantee of working at Google, plus the perk of working in a small startup with more email and transparency, that's a really, really negative sign. For example, when I interview people, they'll often say, I'm really passionate about what you're doing. And then I'm like, well, where else are you interviewing? And then they'll just list 7 companies that have nothing to do with each other, except they're sort of at the same stage we're at. They're like, I love the problem of discovery, so I'm interviewing at Stripe, Dropbox, Airbnb, Uber. Now I'm also putting into my resume into Google X, into that part of the division. And that's a sign that they're probably not being authentic with what they care about. And those folks, often when things get really hard, they won't stick it out and work through it because they were really signing up for an experience, not for achieving a goal.
I think the other thing that motivates people a great deal in addition to sort of the prospect of sort of affecting some outcome is just sort of the personal development angle. In that a startup, just because it's much kind of more lightly staffed, it's kind of it's much less forgiving, right? In that, even if you're the best person in the world, you're not going to, whether or not you're the best or the worst person in the world, you're probably not going to significantly alter Google's trajectory, right? Whereas if you sort of really want to benchmark yourself and sort of see how much of a contribution and an impact you can make, and I think that prospect is quite compelling to a lot of the best people, then a startup is sort of a much better place to go test that.
All right. Last question. Last question.
So this question is for Ben, but you guys can all answer it. But how has your user base affected your hiring strategy? So Pinterest is a site that's used 80% by women. So how did that affect your initial hiring decisions?
How has your user base affected your hiring strategy?
Yeah, so conventional wisdom is you only hire people that religiously use your product every single day, and that probably works really well if you're making an API. It's probably amazing. For us, we screen for people that are ambitious and excited about the vision of cracking discovery online, and they have to know like exactly how our service works and have to have used it, but they may not be a lifelong user. And that, for us, is this great opportunity because we can be like, what is the barrier that's preventing you from using it? Come join, remove that barrier, and help us get closer to kind of that vision. I don't know, there's a lot of, if you read any startup book, there's all this like startup wisdom that sounds like really reasonable, but it's only useful if it works in your particular circumstance. And so for us, we've had to sort of broaden the lens a little bit and looking broadly about people that are ambitious about the mission, that care about the product and our approach to building products, even if from day one they weren't our earliest users.
Okay. The one thing I'll just tack onto that is that when we talked about the fact that it's really hard to hire for those early employees, and you have people who have other good options. You're very much at the ugly duckling stage. Finding people who are passionate about your product can be a great way to find people, because there you kind of have an unnatural advantage over other companies. And so I know for sure in Stripe's case, we definitely we hired, I think it was 4 Stripe users in the very early days, and those were people who we probably couldn't have gotten otherwise. I'm sure it was the same in Pinterest's case, where like you'll get all this benefit of working at Pinterest, and hey, it's Pinterest. You get to work where you pin. Yeah.
Thank you guys very much for coming in today.
Thank you.